This week is the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we discuss this important anniversary. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for liberty. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Hey, Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be back with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your emails. And thank you for your great support. As you all know, this is our mid-year fundraising drive, and we really appreciate the initial response we're getting and hope you guys will help us out in as generous a fashion as you can in these difficult times. As you know, we're living in some bad times when it comes to liberty. But as the old saying goes, this is when times get tough, the tough get going. And that's what we're doing here at FFF. And we appreciate your help in getting us on the track, helping us get America on the track to freedom, peace, prosperity, and harmony. All right, Richard, this is the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a lot of articles and op-eds and editorials that are being written about it, quite naturally so. You know, I remember one of the times that you and I wrote on this subject was before 9/11, like within the year before 9/11. And there was a newspaper here in Virginia that published our articles, or my article. I can't remember how many they published. But I mean, there was this tremendous negative reaction among the newspapers' readers. They were sending these nasty emails that accusing us here at FFF of hating America and being unpatriotic and maybe even treasonous and so forth. And it was a phenomenal reaction. But it seems like in the period of time since then, times have really changed, because I'm amazed at the number of op-eds and articles and perspectives that are in the mainstream press now that are really acknowledging that this was a super bad thing to do. You know, it's always been justified by the proponents of the bombings and by President Truman and his cohorts that this was a way to shorten the war, and that if they hadn't dropped the bombs, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, U.S. soldiers, would have died, and 1 million Japanese in an invasion. Well, you know, as historians have pointed out, this is pure nonsense. That Japan was ready to surrender. The only thing they wanted was a guarantee that their emperor would be treated respectfully in terms of no torture, no execution. That was their only condition. And the U.S. under Truman took the same position as Franklin Roosevelt. No, we want an unconditional surrender. And of course, you know, the Japanese took that to mean, oh, well, this means they're going to do bad things to our emperor, because what's the big deal of just agreeing to that condition? And so they kept fighting on. Let's face it, there's no requirement in war that you demand an unconditional surrender. You can accept whatever terms you want. And that was certainly not an unreasonable term. In fact, they ended up agreeing to the term anyway after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that really isn't the main reason that this thing was so horrible. The main reason was really it was a war crime. I mean, they were targeting women, children, seniors in these two cities. I mean, that's what they predominantly were, was just cities composed of regular non-combatants. And there's an old principle in war that you don't target non-combatants. We see this honored, at least lip service being given to it in America's perpetual wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East, when the military says, oh, well, we didn't intend to hit those civilians that just got killed. What they're acknowledging is that it's a war crime to target civilians. Well, that's exactly what they did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They targeted civilians. And even if their argument had justification that shortens a war, that is not a defense to a war crime. The only reason that Truman and the pilots that dropped the bombs were not convicted of war crimes was that America won the war. If they had lost the war, there is no doubt that they would have been brought up on war crimes charges. And an example of this phenomenon is Lieutenant William Calley. During the Vietnam War, he and his men were shooting up civilians in a village there in Vietnam, South Vietnam, just defenseless people killing women, children, seniors. And it finally came out, and the military prosecuted him as a war criminal, and rightly so, and he was convicted. Now, if Calley had said, oh, well, I felt like by killing these people, I was going to shorten the war, that wouldn't have been a defense. They never would have accepted that defense. And it's not a defense to a war crime. I mean, you know, in war, bad things happen. It's the nature of war that soldiers kill soldiers. And that's just the way it is. And if soldiers had to have died in an invasion, well, that's the way war goes. But to say, oh, by targeting women and children and seniors, we can save the lives of these soldiers, well, I consider that not only a war crime, but an act of cowardice. People like General Patton would never have accepted that justification for saving the lives of soldiers. Hey, let's kill those women and children because that'll save the lives of soldiers. No way. And in fact, I think it's like 7 out of the 8, or maybe all 8 of the top generals in World War II, at the end of World War II, said that this was a moral travesty, a horror story as to what happened. And it was a horror story. I mean, all the pictures, the photographs, the stories that came out, it's a moral abomination. And I think that's what has really caused people to turn against these two atomic bombings. So what do you think?
Well, I understand the thinking of the Japanese towards the end of the war, not their emperor. I mean, if we were in a war right now, wouldn't we all say to the likely victorious country with which we're at war, please, please, don't do anything bad to Donald Trump?
Yeah.
I'm so bad. What can I say? I'm such a bad guy. Anyway. Serious. Okay. Obviously, when we think that between those two bombings, it's estimated that 185,000 people were killed, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, as well as the untold number who were either injured or had the radiation poisoning, which was excruciatingly a painful death as the years and the decades went on. But we have to appreciate that this was the, how can I put it, the conclusion or the encapsulation of a philosophy that dominated that war on, in fact, both sides, whether it be the Nazis and the Japanese on their side, or the British and Americans on their side. And that was, this was a total war. And in total war, there is little or no distinction between civilians and the military. It is estimated that US conventional fire bombings of Japanese cities in 1944 and then in the first half of 1945 killed as many as 300,000 Japanese in these incendiary fire bombings. In March, they did these fire bombings of Tokyo, and it is estimated that in the firebombing of Tokyo in March, approximately 85,000 people were killed. And if it's saying, oh, you see, this is indicative of American racism, well, America was an equal opportunity mass murderer in this sense. How do I mean by that? Though my language is probably going to strike some as provocative. Also in March of 1945, the United States and the British undertook fire bombings of German cities, as they had been undertaking for quite a while. Hamburg was firebombed in this way over several days and nights. It caused such a fire that the air was sucked out of the oxygen was sucked out of the air, and people were suffocating in Hamburg before they actually died from burns. In fact, the heat was so intense that people were melting into the asphalt, either before or after they had been died in these fire bombings. So unfortunately, this was a process of and method that the United States and the British on their side, and we know the horrendous atrocities of cruel and brutal mass murder of the Nazis, took as a given. the idea that you try to minimize civilian targets, that you try to reduce the number of civilian deaths. The US and the British, if you had talked to them at that time, would have given lip service to that. But they would rationalize that because of the lack of sufficient precision bombing tools, they had to do this carpet bombing. And especially the British, though they were joined by the Americans, the British took the attitude that massive civilian bombings were meant to demoralize the population. That if we weaken their spirit of the general civilian population, this will reduce or put pressure on the respective governments, the German or the Japanese, to sue for surrender. But the fact is that's not the case, because when the Germans earlier in the war, during the famous Blitz in the Battle of Britain in the summer and fall of 1940, undertook their civilian attacks on British cities, Coventry, London, and so on. Part of the German strategy was to break the will for fighting of the British population. If anything, it made the people more resistant and indignant, waving their fists, those damn Germans, we're not going to give in to this. Well, don't be surprised that human nature is basically the same everywhere. That's going to be part of the reaction of Germans and Japanese. Those damn British and Americans, we're not going to give in. So it failed as its psychological purpose. And all it did was bring this mass murder to multitudes of hundreds of thousands of people, with this highlighted in capstone by the use of these nuclear bombs. Now, as you were saying, the fact is that both at the time and certainly retrospectively, it was clear that these bombings, these nuclear bombings, were not necessarily needed to bring the war to a quicker conclusion. For instance, the US military had the job of undertaking a strategy for the invasion of the Japanese homelands. The first attack would be undertaken on the southern main island of Kyushu. And they estimated that the loss of American lives would be no greater. Now, of course, that's a terrible way to put it, because the loss of any lives, right? But from the military point of view, would be no greater than the loss of American lives in liberating the Philippines, particularly the main island of Luzon. Also, the American military had successfully broken not just the Japanese political codes, which had been done earlier, but the military codes. So they knew the defense strategies that the Japanese were planning to undertake to ward off such an invasion of the home island. And therefore, the US could have known where the Japanese planes for kamikaze pilots might have been collected. The coastal batteries could have all been decimated before the landing of any American soldiers. Then on top of that, in July of 1945, this is all shown by the records too, the Japanese had put out feelers to both the Swiss diplomats in Tokyo and the Soviet diplomats in Tokyo. The Soviet Union has signed a non-aggression pact with Japan in April of 1941, so that after the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, and we and then the British were involved in this Pacific and Southeast Asian war against the Japanese, the Soviet Union, Stalin, was at peace with the Japanese through the entire war. They did not intervene until the dropping of the first atomic bomb, and then they broke their non-aggression pact and invaded Manchuria. But the fact is that in July, while the Soviets were still at peace with them too, they put out feelers through the Soviet embassy to the United States for the terms that you're talking about. We would seriously be willing to consider a negotiated peace, but negotiated only because the preservation of the emperor. They didn't ask not to be occupied. They didn't ask for any of the usual things that could be imagined, but it's the preservation of the dynasty and the life of the emperor. But the Truman administration was unwilling to do that. Now, why? Now, a number of hypotheses have been given. The one that you brought out, saving American lives, even at the cost of huge civilian lives, as the case of the bombs. We have the bomb, and we're now facing the Soviet Union as a potential rival once the war is over. Well, maybe we need to have a lesson to demonstrate the power that America has to make Stalin think twice in any immediate post-war period. Then if we spent all this expense on the Manhattan Project and the Germans have surrendered, how do we get a payoff? We surely have to use this. Now, these are the types of explanations, partly based upon evidence. It's hard to really determine what's in a person's mind, including Truman's mind. But those are the types of things that clearly were at work, or possibly at work, in the bringing of the use of these bombs into reality, when in fact, both at the time and certainly retrospectively, it's clear it didn't have to occur. And of course, this now seems something that the heightened of cruelty in dropping of such a massively destructive bomb on civilian targets.
Yeah, you make a lot of good points. When you were talking about the firebombing of the cities, there's also the famous firebombing of Dresden.
Yes.
Here was a city, I mean, just a cultural center. No military purpose at all. It was just sheer vengeance there near the end of the war, when Germany was already a defeated nation. It was just a matter of time that the Allied powers were going to take over. So there was absolutely no need to firebomb Dresden. And they decimated the city. And it was all just civilians, seniors, children, women. It was horrific. And then, of course, as you point out, there was all the firebombings of Japanese cities that preceded this and preceded the atomic bombings. And it just befuddles me that people don't see that the horrors of what they called the good war. How many millions of people died in this conflagration, and how necessary was it? I mean, that's the real horror of this from the standpoint of the United States. That if you go back to World War I, and you wonder, well, why did the U.S. intervene there? I mean, what was the point? And the idea Wilson had was, well, if we can bring the total defeat of Germany, this will finally settle, wars in Europe. Never again will there be wars. Well, it was ridiculous. They had a total defeat of Germany. They got the Treaty of Versailles. They had everything they wanted, and that's what gave rise to Hitler. If the U.S. had not intervened in World War I, the probability is they would have had a negotiated peace, and then Hitler would not have had the Treaty of Versailles to seize upon in his rise to power, because everybody was agreeing anyway that the Treaty of Versailles was just a treaty of vengeance. And then you have World War II. They're fighting again within a relatively short period of time. And here's Roosevelt. I mean, the American people said, no, never again. You just let them fight. It doesn't involve us. The probability is, it's almost a certainty, that Germany was going to fight the Soviet Union at some point, because Hitler was as vehemently anti-communist as the United States became after World War II. I mean, he was essentially fighting his Cold War before the U.S. was fighting their Cold War. And so the fight was inevitably going to be between Germany and the Soviet Union, but Great Britain issues that ridiculous guarantee to Poland, which they knew they could never honor. And the U.S. could have just stayed out of it. And yet, here is Roosevelt maneuvering, manipulating, trying to get the U.S. involved in the war because the American people said no. So he couldn't get a congressional declaration of war. So he starts provoking the Germans. They refuse to take the bait, but by identifying submarines and so forth, ships of the Germans in the Atlantic. So he goes to the Pacific, and it's so clear what his strategy is. That if I can just provoke the Japanese into fighting, then that will be my backdoor to getting involved in the European conflict, because Germany and Japan will unite once the conflict starts. So he has this oil embargo on Japan that he knows is going to squeeze them. And it did squeeze them. It was a remarkable, successful embargo. They were over there occupying China. They had an ongoing war. They needed the oil. So they were going to do something to get their oil. I mean, there's no question. The Japanese government was a war government. And so that was the whole idea of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was never, we're going to invade the United States. We hate the United States. We're coming to conquer the United States. It was all about oil. They were going to invade the Dutch East Indies because of the U.S. embargo. They needed the oil, and they hoped to knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet to give them the opportunity to get their oil in the Dutch East Indies without U.S. interference. Well, if Roosevelt had never done this, Richard, if he had never engaged in this machination, it's a virtual certainty the U.S. never would have gone to war with Japan, because Japan had no interest in going to war against the United States. So all the U.S. soldiers that got killed in that war, all the Japanese people that got killed, the people at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, it's just a giant horror story, and it all is oriented toward Roosevelt's philosophy and method of intervention. Because as soon as he gets his attack on Pearl Harbor, oh, and now, okay, you see, we've been attacked. It's a day of infamy. We have no choice. We have to go to war. I mean, it's really a horror story of interventionism, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, the question is that, everything is what if history. But if the United States had not imposed this embargo on the Japanese in 1940 and 41, the Japanese would have been able to continue to import oil, certainly from the Dutch East Indies, what we now call Indonesia, was a Dutch colony, and continue this war in China. But to what end? The fact is that Japan had first invaded China in 1931 and set up this puppet state in Manchuria, which it called Manchukuo. Any of the viewers and listeners remember a movie which, from 25 years ago, called The Last Emperor. It's about the last Chinese emperor, Henry Puyi, who was eliminated in the revolution in China of 1911, but the Japanese then made him the puppet emperor of their puppet state of Manchukuo. But then in 1937, not satisfied with that, the Japanese undertake an invasion of the rest of the mainland of China. But after 4 years of this, they had not succeeded. They had occupied a lot of Chinese territory, but they couldn't defeat the Chinese people, and there was far more land than their army could successfully occupy, and to defeat the Chinese government and the Chinese behind the frontline guerrilla forces. So how long would this war have continued? The Japanese were bogged down. In fact, if the Chinese government had just been allowed to continue to buy armaments from Western sources, including the United States, the chances are the Japanese would have eventually have had to sue for some type of compromise arrangement with the Chinese, because this was going to be an unwinnable war, bogged down in the mainland of China. Instead, by the United States imposing this embargo and leading to Pearl Harbor, it became a global cataclysm that was destructive to hundreds of thousands of lives of Americans, to Japanese, to all the people of Southeast Asia who were first then overrun by the Japanese, and then were facing the Americans and the British, quote, liberating these areas, leading to moving on to Japan itself. So this was as unnecessary an extension of that tragic conflict between Japan and the Chinese. And without a doubt, it's all Japan's fault. They aggressively wanted to gain the resources and control of a good part of China. But the fact is, it would have been localized, if you will, however tragic it was, rather than making it a Pacific-wide conflict with far more destruction and loss of life. And that all sits at the steps of the White House with Franklin Roosevelt being president. But the fact is that this idea of a total war till a total victory was continued by Harry Truman. In fact, he met with Stalin at the Potsdam Conference after the surrender of the Germans in Europe in July of 1945. And while at the Potsdam Conference, a telegram arrived from Washington informing Truman that they had had the successful test of one of the experimental atomic bombs in the desert near Los Alamos. And very excited about this. Of course, the British knew about it because they were involved in the Manhattan Project, but they thought they had kept it a secret from Stalin. And so Stalin, of course, knew all about it because he had all of his spies and fellow travelers as part of the Manhattan Project. They've been passing along all this information, including the data. But so Truman walks up to Stalin and says, I have news about an exciting new weapon, thinking that he's going to impress Stalin. Of course, Stalin just sort of looks at him with a blank stare because he knows it before Truman does. but the fact is that this is Truman's excitement that America has something that no one else has, and the idea of proving it to the world by bringing the Japanese to their knees by refusing to accept any compromise of the unconditional surrender terms. So this was all a tragedy of cruelty and brutality, which shows why one should reject not only total collectivism, that is the political and economic control of society, but one should reject the idea of total war. One always must realize there's a difference between the civilian and the military. If I can just make an analogy about this, let us suppose that a bank robber has robbed a bank and is being pursued by the police, and he goes into an apartment building and takes some civilian innocent people hostage. Is the first order of business of the police department to bomb the building to get this guy, to immediately send in a massive force with no question or concern about the innocent civilians who will be killed in the process of getting the bank robber or bank robbers? No. The idea is that it's a hostage situation. You try to negotiate. You try to wear them down. You try to psychologically get them to surrender. You try to, deny them maybe food, and you try. Violence is meant to be, in principle, the last resort, not the first, precisely because you're concerned with minimizing the harm to the innocents, including those being held as hostages. But in war, this is the reverse. While they give lip service to it, and certainly in World War II, there were no distinctions. Everyone on the other side of the battle line is an enemy who is fair game to be obliterated. And that's the tragedy of World War II.
Yeah, and the shame of it is that there's inevitably a lot of people within the society that are opposed to their own government, just like here in the United States, that are opposed to the war. I mean, there was the famous story of the White Rose in Germany that was resisting the Hitler regime in the midst of the war, and later after they got caught, being accused of treason and enemies of the state and so forth. There was the assassination attempt on Hitler that was widely supported. So here you are bombing these cities, and you're in the process killing a lot of civilians that really are against the regime as well. And inevitably that happens in Japan as well. And your point about the Soviet Union is a very interesting one, that there's some arguments that are made that Truman dropped the bombs in order to show the Soviet Union these weapons that we had now, and that the Soviet Union was going to have to kowtow to the United States in the post-war era if they know what's good for them, because we're the only ones that can do this, and we can do it to you. Now, I don't know how much validity there is to that. There's also the argument made that the real reason the Japanese surrendered was not because of the 2 atomic bombs, but because the Soviet Union had come in after the first atomic bomb and declared war on on Japan, and that the last thing that Japan wanted was to come under a Soviet communist occupation, and so they immediately surrendered to the United States. It's probably a factor of both, as many of these things are. I think it's also important to note what you and I have noted for many, many years, including in our book, The Failure of America's Foreign Wars, is the perverse outcome of this so-called good war. I mean, we're always taught, we're indoctrinated from the first grade of, the Allied powers won, we won World War II, we defeated Nazi Germany. That's not exactly true, because there's problems with that pronoun we. I mean, all of Eastern Europe ended up under the control of the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was, quote, our ally and our partner, which is really ironic because, later the U.S. fights this huge Cold War, which is what Hitler was doing, was fighting this Cold War against the Soviet Union. The United States essentially takes on the same enemy after having the Soviet Union as their partner and ally during the war, which they didn't have to do. They could have fought independently of the Soviet Union. They might have even been better off doing it that way, because they could have maybe entered a negotiated peace with Germany that would have entailed the Western takeover of Eastern Europe instead of the Soviet takeover. But at the end of the war, it wasn't us who won the war. It was the Soviet Union who won the war. And the only reason the pronoun we is part of it is because during the war, the Soviet Union was a partner and ally. But as soon as the war is over, now you've got the big Cold War, the conversion of the federal government to a national security state, this new official enemy. And Eastern Europe stays under communist control for the next 40 something years. Well, okay, so they, they were under Nazi control. No question. That's why the British supposedly declared war, that they're going to liberate Poland from Nazi tyranny, which they end up doing, but only to have Poland and Czechoslovakia and all the rest of Eastern Europe and the Balkans and so forth end up under communist tyranny. And now that may be a big victory for us or we, but I guarantee it was not a victory for the people of Eastern Europe. I mean, they never celebrated World War II as a victory, and they still don't, because they ended up under communist rule. So you end up with this massive devastation with really a perverse result. And then, of course, within a short period of time, 4 years or so, China falls to the communists. So, I mean, this is all the legacy of World War II, along with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the whole Cold War. It really is a perverse war all the way around.
Yes, we always should remember that there's nothing that happens that does not have unintended consequences. Now, sometimes the unintended consequences can be good things that we hadn't anticipated might fall our way. But the tragedy of especially government policies is that 9 times out of 10, I'm tempted to say 100 times out of 10, but I'm trying to be impartial here, dispassionate. 9 times out of 10, invariably many, if not most, of the consequences from various government interventions and aggressive policies are negative unintended consequences. And certainly if you look at the stream of the half century after the end of the Second World War, there was a vast amount of negative unintended consequences. If the war had not gone the way it did, the Soviets would not have entered China at the end of the war against the Japanese. They would not have given their degrees of support to Mao's guerrillas, and it might have been the case that Mao and his communist forces might not have come to power in China. Korea might not have been divided, as it ended up being after the war between US and Soviet zones, which has now been continued in this ongoing tension between North and South Korea. And as you were pointing out correctly, the fact is that Stalin gained all of Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, the big three, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, met in the Crimea to settle the post-World War period. There was the idea, free elections in Eastern Europe, though most of Roosevelt's non-communist advisors considered this absurd with no guarantees. But shortly after the Yalta Conference, a delegation of Yugoslav communists were in Moscow. That would have been in April of 1945. And one of them, Milovan Dijos, wrote a book, Conversations with Stalin, about that visit to Moscow. And he says that in one of the conversations, Stalin said, where an army stops is where its political regime stops. He basically was saying is that as far as an army goes, that victorious power imposes its political and ideological system under all the peoples that its army has conquered. So he had no intention of any promises of free elections in the Eastern European countries that the Red Army, quote, liberated. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland. And of course, he just re-gobbled up the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And then gained occupation zones as part of this Yalta Agreement in both Austria and Germany. That became, of course, the East Germany, the communist state that existed in Eastern Germany until the reunification of Germany in 1989, 1990. But for those Eastern Europeans, and I've traveled in Eastern Europe a bit, and particularly those who were old enough to remember both the war and the aftermath of it, said that, yeah, were they glad to see the Nazis gone? The Nazis were brutal, inhumane, mass murdering. You did not want to be under the control of the Nazis. But as much as they were glad to see the end of the Germans, the arrival of the Soviets, their imposing of communist dictatorial governments, their abolition of private property, their imposing of secret polices and arrests at night, and just killing anyone they considered as a serious enemy, this was not their idea of a free world at the end of the Second World War. And that lasted for almost another half century. So that in that sense, certainly in Europe, the victor of the war was Joseph Stalin and the empire that he therefore had until almost the end of the 20th century. And so the victor was a communist dictator and not the ideal of freedom, certainly in that part of the world.
Right, and then there's the moral hypocrisy too, that you know, they brought up the Nazis on war crimes at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, prosecuted, convicted, executed many of them, and yet just turned a total blind eye to the war crimes that had been committed by the Soviets, by the communists. I mean, when the Soviet soldiers were invading Germany, there was massive rapes taking place of German women. I mean, it was just horrific. And we're talking about civilians again here. And nobody was brought up on charges there because the Soviets were our partner and ally. And then, of course, there was the famous killing of those 10,000 Polish soldiers, officers in the Katyn forest, where they just blamed it on, I forget who they blamed it on, but it was just
they blamed it
on Germany. But it was clear it was just a blind eye toward the Soviet Union. So here you have the United States that is implicitly participating in this by not saying anything, by not saying you need to be brought up on war crimes as well. So it was really just this moral abomination that was part of this war effort as well.
Well, you know, the thing is that even before the Second World War began, if there was a crime against humanity, that is a massive killing, an intentional, conscientious, planned, massive killing of millions, it was Stalin through his forced collectivization of the land in the Soviet Union, the taking away of the private farms from the peasants between 1929 and 1933. It is estimated by scholars such as Robert Conquest or Anne Applebaum that anywhere between 9 and 12 million Russians, and particularly Ukrainians, who resisted, did not want to give up their private farms, were basically starved into submission. The grain was taken from them. Supplies were not allowed to come into that area to break the will of the people. So 9 to 12 million people were starved to death, worked to death, were simply shot to break the back of resistance to the forced collectivization of the land and force people into collective farms. 9 to 12 million people. That's larger than the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, which is estimated to be 6 million. Larger than the mass killing of Poles by the Germans in the Second World War, which is estimated to have been approximately 3 million, or the extermination of about 500,000 gypsies throughout Eastern Europe by the Germans.
By the Russians.
The Soviet leader put on trial, including Stalin himself, or even accused or said should be put on trial for these crimes against humanity? No.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute moral horror story. And, you know, as bad as Hitler is, it's just so fascinating that there's a large segment of people that don't recognize that Stalin was just as bad, if not worse. And
if I can just, I apologize. For the viewers and listeners who may be hearing this part of our conversation, I would like to highly recommend a movie that can be watched on Amazon Prime called Mr. Jones. It's a new movie. It is based upon a fellow who went to Moscow in the early 1930s and was the first reporter who got out of Moscow, got to Ukraine, and reported on the mass state-planned starvations of these people. He was ridiculed, he was denied, he was attacked by Walter Duranty, the senior reporter for the New York Times in Moscow, who said there was no famine, partly for which he got a Pulitzer Prize. But this fellow, Jones, was the first one. He was from Wales. He was a sort of a stringer reporter. And he's the one who broke the international news about this. Now, he had to leave the Soviet Union and he went to China. And in 1935, he was in Inner Mongolia, in a part of Inner Mongolia under Japanese control. And it later came out that he was killed by these bandits. He was kidnapped by bandits in Inner Mongolia. But it later came out who either paid or were themselves those bandits, agents of the Soviet secret police. That was Stalin's revenge against this guy for having revealed the truth of the mass murder of people to collectivize the land. I highly recommend this movie, Mr. Jones.
Wow. Well, there's another great article. Well, let me first, I think it's worth, I know we're going over time, but I think it's worth it, that with respect to the Holocaust that you mentioned, I think it's worth noting that Franklin Roosevelt, was given the opportunity of accepting German Jews in the 1930s, that Hitler was willing to let the Jews go out of Germany. He just wanted to get rid of them, but he wasn't killing them. The death machines didn't really get started till the middle of World War II. A lot of people don't recognize that. Now, he was harassing them, abusing them, putting restrictions on their ability to sustain themselves through labor and occupations. But he said, you want to leave, go. And every nation just on earth just refused to accept them. I mean, the anti-Semitic bigotry was not only in Germany. And Roosevelt said, oh, well, we have the quota system and our quota's been filled. And if they did not do that, if Roosevelt had said, screw the quota system, you can come to the United States, that would have meant a lot more people would have had their lives saved, at least the ones that wanted to get out, that were willing to get out. I also want to mention an article that my colleague Bart Frazier has recommended, and Richard, that you're familiar with. I'm getting ready to read it. I haven't read it, by this man, John Hershey, about Hershey. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that article?
Well, it came out shortly after the end of the Second World War. John Hershey was a reporter. He got to Japan not long after the end of the war, following the atomic bomb blast, obviously. And he wrote this long article in the New Yorker, and it was like the entire issue that week or that month. And it was then issued as a small book. I remember reading it in high school, actually. It was assigned to one of my history classes in high school. And it's just called Hiroshima. And it's about what he saw, the degree of devastation, the destruction, the cruelty to those who survived it, and the attitudes of the Americans who first arrived, the callousness and a lack of compassion. It's definitely worth a read. And certainly now at the 75th anniversary of this, it shouldn't be ignored. John Hershey, Hiroshima.
Yeah, we're linking to it in FFF Daily. It'll be on our website either today or tomorrow. I think it was today, but I'm not certain. It could be tomorrow. And yeah, that I read that the New Yorker, they didn't warn their readers that this was going to happen, and they have like a cover of a park and people in a park and so forth. And so people thought it was just going to be this little pleasant issue, and they opened it up, and the entire issue is one article. This one article by John Hershey called Hiroshima. Yeah. So so I'm gonna read it, and from what I understand, it's a phenomenal piece. And as you know, Richard, the U.S. government was trying to censor the devastation. I mean, they recognized the horror that had been unleashed with these two bombs, and so they were trying to prohibit journalists from reporting on what was going on there and the devastation. They were. I mean, it sort of indicates that they were ashamed of what it had done. They didn't want people to find out. And so Hershey's.
Yeah, just mention one other thing is that I believe we reprinted it in our book, The Failure of America's Foreign Wars. And that was back in the mid-1990s. I did a review of a book called The Invasion of Japan by a legitimate scholarly historian. I forget his name. But the theme of his book is that what were the American strategies to invade the Japanese home islands? What would it have taken to defeat them conventionally? What were the estimates by the U.S. military strategists of casualties on both sides? And implicitly, his reason for this analysis, it's a serious historical book, was the issue, did we really need to drop the bombs? And so you can find it on the FFF website. If nothing else, if you go to Google and put in Richard Ebeling, review the invasion of Japan, and that'll take you to my review from 1994, 1995.
Okay, on that note, please accept our apologies for going over. We usually limit it to around 30 minutes, but hope you all enjoyed the program. Again, this is our mid-year fundraising drive. We would greatly appreciate your support. We need your support to keep this message going in terms of getting this country back on the right track. I think everybody in this country recognizes this country's on the wrong track, but there's disagreement on what we need to do to get it on the right track. And if you like our message, on our libertarian message on what we need to do to get America on the right track toward peace and prosperity and harmony and normality in life, I hope you'll support us. So thank you very much for tuning in. Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.